The day the divorce papers were finalized, it rained like the sky was apologizing to me. She didn't cry. She didn't hesitate. She just signed her name and slid the papers across the table like I was a bad investment that no longer promised returns. "I can't live like this anymore," she said, eyes avoiding mine. "Love doesn't pay bills." I nodded. Because at that point, I had already learned how to swallow humiliation quietly. I walked out of the courthouse alone, the echo of her heels fading faster than the marriage we once swore was forever. My phone buzzed, another bank rejection, another reminder of what I wasn't. I went back to my empty apartment, sat on the floor, and laughed. Not because it was funny, but because when you lose everything at once, pain stops being sharp. It becomes calm, focused, dangerous. That night, I made a promise to myself, not to prove her wrong, not to chase revenge, but to become so unrecognizable that even my past wouldn't recognize me. 3 years later, when she collapsed in a 5-star hotel lobby staring at a magazine cover with my face on it, that promise came back to collect its debt. And this is what happened in between. I met her when belief was still something I could afford. Back then, I had nothing that could impress anyone on paper. No savings. No car worth mentioning. No future that looked stable from the outside. What I did have were ideas, wild, unpolished thoughts that spilled out of me like confessions I couldn't stop making. I spoke about businesses that didn't exist yet. About success that lived only in my head. I drew diagrams on napkins in cheap cafes, my hands moving faster than logic, my voice trembling with a hope I didn't yet know how to protect. She listened like it mattered. Not politely. Not patiently. But like she actually saw something. She would lean across the table, chin resting on her palm, eyes fixed on me as if I were telling her a secret meant only for her. Sometimes she smiled before I finished a sentence, like she already believed in the ending even when I was still struggling to explain the beginning. "You sound different," she told me one night, the streetlights painting gold across her face. "Like someone who hasn't been defeated yet." That sentence followed me home. It slept beside me. It became something I lived up to. I was broke, but hopeful. She was practical, but warm. She knew how to calculate, how to plan, how to ground things. I knew how to imagine, how to risk, how to reach for things I couldn't yet touch. Together, it felt balanced, like two halves that completed each other. Or at least, that's what I believed then. One evening, as rain tapped softly against the cafe window, she reached for my hand. Her fingers were warm. Steady. Certain. "We'll build it together," she said. Together. That word settled into my chest and refused to leave. From that moment on, everything I did carried her name silently attached to it. I worked longer hours, chasing opportunities that barely paid but promised experience. I slept less, my nights filled with numbers, plans, and quiet desperation. I ate instant noodles so often that the smell of them became normal, even comforting. Sometimes she laughed about it, calling them our struggle meals, and I laughed too, because laughing made it feel temporary. Every sacrifice felt lighter because she was there. When I came home exhausted, she'd sit beside me and ask how my day went, even if she didn't fully understand what I was trying to build. When I doubted myself, she reminded me of the man she said I was. When rejection emails arrived, she told me failure was proof that I was trying. I mistook encouragement for endurance. I mistook affection for patience. Love has a way of hiding imbalance behind romance. Slowly, almost invisibly, I became the one adjusting more. The one compromising more. My time bent around her schedule. My dreams softened around her comfort. I learned when to stop talking about ideas that made her nervous. Learned which ambitions sounded too risky and which ones felt acceptable. I gave her everything I had, my time, my belief, my unfinished dreams. I let her become the first person I consulted, the last person I tried to reassure. When money was tight, I absorbed the stress so she wouldn't have to feel it. When uncertainty crept in, I carried it quietly, telling myself this was what love looked like. She gave me encouragement, but never patience. Support, but only when it didn't cost her comfort. There were moments, small, sharp moments, when I felt the distance forming. When she checked her phone while I spoke. When her responses became shorter, more measured. When she started asking questions that sounded less like curiosity and more like concern. How long will this take? When will it start working? Are you sure this is realistic? I told myself those were normal questions. Healthy questions. Questions asked by someone who cared. Still, something in me began to shrink. And yet, When I asked her to marry me, she said yes. Not hesitantly. Not reluctantly. She smiled and nodded, eyes shining, hands gripping mine like an anchor. I took that as proof. Because when someone chooses you at your lowest, you believe they'll stay for the climb. The wedding was small. Simple. Affordable. We promised forever in borrowed suits and rented chairs. When she walked toward me, I remember thinking that nothing else mattered, that whatever storms waited ahead, we'd face them together. Marriage, I thought, would make us stronger. Instead, it made the imbalance clearer. Life didn't suddenly improve because we exchanged rings. The pressure doubled. Expectations sharpened. Love became intertwined with outcomes. I felt the weight of being responsible not just for myself, but for the future she envisioned. Some nights, I lay awake beside her, listening to her breathe, wondering if I was enough. Wondering if belief alone could survive the realities creeping closer every day. I told myself love required faith. That struggle was temporary. That someday, she'd look back and be proud of the man I was becoming. I didn't realize then. Some people don't want to climb. They just want to be carried. And the higher the hill, the heavier they feel. One night, long after she'd fallen asleep, I stood by the window holding one of my old napkins, the kind I used to scribble dreams on. The ink had faded. The paper was creased. It felt fragile in my hands, like a reminder of the man I used to be. I folded it carefully and placed it back in my drawer. I didn't know it then, but that was the first thing I quietly put away. And somewhere between belief and reality, between love and expectation, the climb had already begun. And I was carrying more than I understood. Marriage didn't break us overnight. It eroded us quietly, the way water wears down stone, not with force, but with persistence. No single argument marked the beginning. No dramatic moment announced the end. It was subtler than that. Quieter. Almost polite. Rent was always due. Dreams were always postponed. And love slowly became conditional. The apartment we moved into smelled like fresh paint and compromise. Too small for the future we talked about, but just big enough to pretend we were moving forward. At night, the walls felt closer. During the day, the ceiling felt lower. Still, I told myself this was temporary. Everything meaningful starts cramped, I thought. Even dreams need tight spaces to grow. At first, she still asked about my ideas. What are you working on now? What's the next step? I'd explain carefully, choosing words that sounded safer than they felt. She nodded, but her eyes drifted, toward her phone, the clock, the window. Somewhere else. Somewhere more certain. Eventually, the questions changed. How much does it pay? When will it start making money? Is this even stable? Ideas became numbers. Hope became timelines. Love became a performance review. Every month felt like an exam I kept failing by a few points. I brought home plans. She brought home comparisons. Friends' promotions. Cousins' new cars. Strangers on social media who seemed to leap years ahead overnight. Why aren't you like him? She asked once, not angrily, but casually, like the answer should have been obvious. Why can't you earn more? Love isn't enough anymore. That sentence stayed with me longer than she did. I worked harder after that. Took risks that scared me. Quit safer paths for bigger chances. Failed publicly, where people could see it and remember. Every failure arrived like a headline I couldn't erase. Each one etched disappointment deeper into her eyes, until I recognized it even when she didn't speak. I started apologizing instinctively. For markets crashing. For investors backing out. For timing that never aligned. I apologized for not being rich fast enough, as if wealth were a switch I simply hadn't flipped yet. As if effort alone should have bent the world in our favor. Some nights, she sat at the dining table scrolling through her phone while I worked beside her, surrounded by papers and half-finished plans. The silence between us grew thicker than conversation. When I reached for her hand, she let me hold it, but her fingers stayed loose, like she might pull away at any moment. Intimacy became scheduled. Affection became cautious. Silence became safer than hope. I noticed the changes before she ever named them. She dressed differently when we went out, sharper lines, brighter colors, confidence worn like armor. I loved how she looked, but I hated the way she checked our reflection in windows, adjusting herself like she was preparing to be seen by someone else. I watched her smile less when I spoke, laugh louder when others did. At dinners with friends, she went quiet when money came up. Her shoulders stiffened when promotions were mentioned. She avoided eye contact when someone asked what I was working on. That silence hurt more than any insult. I could feel shame replacing affection, settling between us like an uninvited guest. She never said she was embarrassed of me. She didn't have to. It lived in the pauses. In the sighs. In the way she changed the subject when my name came up. Once, I came home soaked from the rain, holding a rejection letter that had fallen apart in my pocket. The ink had bled, the words unreadable, but I already knew what it said. She looked up, glanced at the paper, then back at her screen. "What happened?" she asked. I told her the truth. She nodded. Just once. Then said, "You should think about something more realistic." I stood there, water dripping onto the floor, realizing she wasn't talking about my career. She was talking about me. Still, I stayed. Because I thought loyalty meant endurance. Because I believed love was proven by how much pain you could absorb without leaving. Because walking away felt like failure, and I had already failed enough. I convinced myself this was marriage. That this was what commitment looked like when things got hard. I told myself everyone struggles, everyone doubts, everyone gets tired. But deep down, something else was happening. I was shrinking. I stopped talking about my dreams at night. Stopped sharing unfinished thoughts. Stopped letting myself be seen in the middle of becoming. I began presenting only results, only certainty, because uncertainty no longer felt safe with her. One evening, I found an old letter she had written me before we got married. I'd kept it tucked inside a book I rarely opened anymore. Her handwriting was softer then. The words were full of faith. "I believe in you," it said. "Even when you don't." I sat on the edge of the bed reading it, wondering when belief had turned into expectation, and when expectation had turned into disappointment. She came in, glanced at the letter, and smiled politely. "That was a long time ago," she said, like it was a joke. I folded the paper carefully, my hands trembling more than I wanted to admit. That night, lying beside her, I stared at the ceiling and felt something dangerous settle in my chest. Not anger, not resentment, but clarity. The quiet realization that loyalty without dignity is just slow self-destruction. I didn't say anything. I didn't leave. But somewhere between the unpaid rent and the unspoken disappointment, between the man I was becoming and the man she wanted me to already be, something inside me began to detach. And I didn't know yet that detachment, once it starts, never stops quietly. She asked for the divorce on a Tuesday. Not a dramatic day. Not a day heavy with meaning. Just a Tuesday, like she'd scheduled the end of us between errands. The sky outside was pale, undecided. The kind of gray that doesn't threaten rain but offers no comfort either. We sat at the small dining table we once argued about buying because it was temporary. Now, it was the only witness left. She had already prepared everything. The papers were stacked neatly. Her pen rested on top. Her hands didn't shake. Calm. Prepared. Emotionally gone. "I need stability," she said, folding her fingers together as if she were in a meeting. "I can't gamble my life on potential." Potential. The word hung between us like something fragile and already broken. I stared at the grain of the table, tracing old scratches with my eyes, marks from rushed dinners, late nights, careless moments when we were still pretending we had time. I nodded once. Not because I agreed, but because I finally understood. She wasn't angry. She wasn't cruel. She didn't list my failures or raise her voice. That would have been easier to survive. Instead, she spoke with the finality of someone who had already grieved privately and moved on. "I've thought about this for a long time," she continued. "This isn't sudden." Of course it wasn't. Sudden things come with emotion. This came with resolution. I didn't beg. The version of me who once would have, who would have promised change, begged for patience, sacrificed another piece of himself, was already exhausted. Something inside me had snapped, not loudly, not violently, but completely. Like a rope worn thin by years of tension, finally giving way without sound. I realized then that if I begged, it wouldn't be for love. It would be for permission to keep disappearing. So I stayed quiet. She slid the papers toward me. Her nails were manicured, careful. I wondered when she'd found the time for that. Probably in the hours I spent working late, convincing myself sacrifice was attractive. I picked up the pen. It felt heavier than it should have. I signed my name slowly, each letter deliberate, like I was carving it into something permanent. With every stroke, memories surfaced uninvited, late-night talks, shared meals, promises whispered into darkness. None of them stopped my hand. When I finished, I pushed the papers back. She exhaled, relieved. That hurt more than anger ever could. She stood first. Picked up her bag. Looked around the apartment one last time, her eyes passing over me like I was already part of the furniture, something left behind because it no longer matched her future. I hope things work out for you, she said. Hope. Another word that felt foreign now. The door closed softly behind her. No slam. No tears. Just the click of a decision locking itself in place. She walked away lighter. I stayed behind heavier, but awake. I stood there for a long time, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic, the ordinary world continuing without regard for what had just ended. The apartment felt larger suddenly. Emptier. Like it had exhaled her and kept me. The world didn't stop. Bills still came. Emails still arrived. Deadlines still waited. I made coffee out of habit, even though my hands trembled enough to spill it. I sat on the couch where we once planned vacations we never took. The cushion beside me dipped slightly, remembering her shape better than I ever could. I didn't cry. Not because I was strong. But because grief hadn't caught up yet. Instead, something colder settled in, a clarity sharp enough to hurt. I saw the last few years for what they were. The slow negotiations. The way love had turned transactional. The moments I'd apologized for existing in progress rather than completion. I wasn't angry at her. That surprised me. She had chosen certainty over faith. Comfort over climb. There was honesty in that, even if it came too late to save us. What hurt wasn't that she left. It was realizing how long she'd already been gone. As evening crept in, the sky darkened, finally committing to rain. Drops traced lines down the windows, blurring the city into something softer, less defined. I stood there watching, feeling like my life had just been wiped clean of outlines. On the table, the divorce papers sat beside an old envelope. I recognized it immediately. A letter she'd written years ago, the one I'd saved. I picked it up, unfolded it carefully. The paper was worn thin at the creases. I believe in you, it said. Even when you don't. I read it once. Then again. The words didn't hurt the way they used to. They felt like evidence from another life. Proof that belief had existed here once, even if it hadn't survived. I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. This time, I didn't put it away. I set it on the desk, beside my laptop, where it could watch what came next. That night, I didn't drink. I didn't call anyone. I didn't fall apart. I opened a notebook. A blank one. The kind that smells faintly of paper and possibility. I wrote down everything I'd avoided thinking about. All the ideas I'd softened. All the risks I'd postponed to keep someone comfortable. I didn't censor myself. I didn't ask whether it sounded realistic. For the first time in years, I didn't ask for permission. Outside, the rain grew heavier, drumming against the windows like applause for something just beginning. The city lights flickered through the glass, distorted but persistent. I realized then that love hadn't failed me. Fear had. And it no longer had a vote. I closed the notebook slowly, my heart beating steadier than it had in months. The apartment was still empty. The future was still uncertain. But something had shifted. That night, I didn't cry. I planned. And in that quiet, rain-soaked room, with nothing left to lose and no one left to convince, I became dangerous in the only way that matters. Focused. Rock bottom stripped me of fear. There was nothing left to protect, nothing left to pretend for. When you've already lost the person who mattered most, the opinions of the rest of the world become background noise. Fear requires something to lose. I had already lost it. So I began cutting. Not dramatically. Not angrily. Precisely. I sold everything unnecessary, furniture we chose together, clothes I wore to look acceptable instead of capable, objects that reminded me of a life built around compromise. The apartment emptied slowly. Each item leaving felt like a breath returning to my lungs. I kept only what I needed to work. A desk. A chair. A laptop. The silence that followed was unbearable at first. No television murmuring in the background. No phone buzzing with forced conversations. Just the hum of my own thoughts, loud, relentless, honest. I cut distractions next. Social media disappeared. Nights out vanished. Even music felt indulgent, so I let that go too. I stopped answering calls from people who asked how I was doing without wanting the truth. I didn't need sympathy. I needed space. Then I cut people. Not because they were cruel, but because they were comfortable. They reminded me of who I used to be. Of dinners, jokes, distractions that slowed the fire forming inside me. I couldn't afford softness anymore. Loneliness became my discipline. I woke before sunrise every day. The sky was always the same color, gray-blue, undecided, like it hadn't yet chosen hope or despair. I liked that. It felt honest. I worked while the world slept, because in those hours, there were no expectations. Just effort and outcome. I poured myself into work with a devotion I once reserved for love. Where I used to wait for messages, I waited for results. Where I used to reread old conversations, I reread contracts and code and numbers that actually responded when I pushed them hard enough. Work didn't need reassurance. It didn't need comfort. It demanded precision, and rewarded it honestly. I failed again. Harder this time. Louder. Projects collapsed. Deals evaporated. People I trusted walked away when things looked uncertain. Failure stung differently now, not as humiliation, but as instruction. Each loss left behind data. Each rejection sharpened my instincts. I learned faster. I failed smarter. I stopped romanticizing effort and started respecting execution. I stopped chasing validation and started building systems. I no longer asked, is this enough? I asked, why did this break, and how do I make it unbreakable? Pain became fuel. Not the explosive kind, the steady burning kind that doesn't flicker out when conditions worsen. I carried it quietly, like a second heartbeat. Every doubt she ever voiced. Every look of disappointment. Every silence that replaced affection. I didn't run from it. I used it. Some nights, exhaustion hit so hard I had to lie on the floor, staring at the ceiling, my body buzzing from too much caffeine and too little rest. The ceiling fan clicked rhythmically above me, broken in one corner, like it was keeping time for my descent, or my ascent. I never fixed it. I liked the imperfection. It reminded me I wasn't waiting for comfort anymore. While she moved on to comfort, I moved into obsession. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she was doing well. Better, even. New places. New routines. A life that fit her perfectly, stable, curated, safe. I didn't ask questions. I didn't look her up. I didn't need to. Comfort had chosen her. Obsession had chosen me. Days blurred into nights. I tracked progress obsessively, spreadsheets, timelines, metrics that told me the truth without softening it. When something failed, I didn't spiral. I adjusted. When something worked, I didn't celebrate. I scaled. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to change. The numbers stopped bleeding. The silence stopped feeling empty. The work started talking back. I remember the first real breakthrough. It wasn't cinematic. No applause. No dramatic reveal. Just a quiet notification on my screen confirming something I had been building alone, piece by piece, was finally standing. I stared at it for a long time. Then I closed the laptop and went for a walk. It was raining lightly, the kind that doesn't soak you, just reminds you the world is alive. Street lights reflected off the pavement like broken stars. I walked without direction, my hands in my pockets, my breath steady. For the first time since the divorce, I didn't feel heavy. I felt grounded. I thought about the man I had been, the one who needed permission to dream, who softened himself to fit someone else's definition of success. I felt something close to grief for him. He had loved honestly. He had believed deeply. But belief alone had never been the problem. Misplaced belief was. When I returned home, I found the old letter again, the one that once anchored me. I read it under the dim light of my desk lamp. The words still held warmth, but they no longer defined me. I folded it carefully. This time, I placed it in a drawer and closed it. Not in anger. Not in denial. In completion. Weeks turned into months. Momentum replaced desperation. The obsession sharpened into mastery. I stopped working to escape pain and started working to build something undeniable. And quietly, dangerously, something real began to take shape. Not success. Not yet. But inevitability. One night, as I reviewed projections that no longer felt like fantasies, I leaned back in my chair and noticed something unsettling. I wasn't afraid anymore. Not of failure. Not of loss. Not of being alone. Rock bottom hadn't destroyed me. It had trained me. I closed my laptop, the room dark except for the city lights bleeding through the window. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed, life continuing without regard for my transformation. I smiled, not wide, not proud. Focused. Because obsession, when left uninterrupted long enough, doesn't just change outcomes. It changes who you become. And whoever I was becoming next was not going to ask the world for permission to arrive. Success didn't announce itself. It didn't arrive with fireworks or congratulatory messages flooding my phone. There was no moment where the world stopped to recognize what I had been building in silence. Instead, it accumulated quietly, like dust on a shelf no one checked anymore, until one day it was impossible to ignore. The first deal closed on an ordinary afternoon. No applause. No witnesses. Just a notification, a signature, and a number that stayed where it was supposed to stay. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, my reflection faint in the dark glass. I felt nothing dramatic, no surge of pride, no urge to celebrate. Just a steady confirmation that the work had worked. That night, I didn't tell anyone. I cooked for myself, ate slowly, and went back to work. The silence felt earned. Almost sacred. The first breakthrough followed weeks later. It came disguised as a conversation that wasn't supposed to matter, an introduction, a cautious exchange of ideas, a meeting scheduled without expectation. I walked into it prepared to explain myself. I walked out without needing to. Yes, they said. Not eventually. Not conditionally. Just yes. I stepped outside into sunlight that felt sharper than usual, the air humming with traffic in motion. For a moment, I stood there, hands in my pockets, grounding myself. I had imagined this moment before, how I'd feel, who I'd call. I called no one. I had learned that some victories are quieter when they are real. The third moment, the impossible one, arrived without ceremony. An opportunity one once would have chased desperately now approached me instead. The email sat unread for hours because I was busy working on something else. When I finally opened it, my pulse didn't spike. It settled. That's when I knew something had changed. I stayed silent. No posts. No updates. No subtle hints meant to be noticed by people who once doubted me. I didn't reach back. Not to her. Not to anyone who left. Not to the versions of myself that once needed validation. True growth doesn't look backward. I understood that now. There were moments when temptation flickered, late at night, scrolling mindlessly, catching glimpses of lives that once intersected with mine. Smiles. Vacations. Comfort. The world she chose. I never lingered long enough for regret to form. That chapter was closed. I had learned the cost of reopening doors that only led to rooms I had already outgrown. My apartment changed slowly, reflecting the shift I hadn't announced. Better lighting. A desk that didn't wobble. Art on the walls, not expensive, just intentional. One painting in particular stayed with me, a lone figure walking into fog, posture steady, destination unseen. I liked that. It reminded me that clarity isn't always visible from the outside. Work became rhythm instead of obsession. The frantic edge dulled, replaced by precision. I delegated. Structured. Built teams instead of walls. I learned to trust outcomes more than effort, results more than sacrifice. I was no longer trying to prove that I deserved success. I was deciding what kind of success deserved me. Sometimes, in rare quiet moments, I thought of her, not with longing, not with resentment, but with distance. Like remembering a city you once lived in but could never return to. I wondered if she was happy. I wondered if comfort had filled the space belief once occupied. Then I wondered why I was wondering at all. The truth settled easily. I wasn't building revenge. Revenge requires an audience. It needs witnesses. It needs the past to remain relevant. I was building legacy. Legacy doesn't rush. It doesn't shout. It doesn't explain itself. Legacy waits. I wrote less about feelings and more about vision. My notebooks filled with plans that stretched years ahead, not months. I stopped imagining how success would look to others and started shaping how it would feel to live inside. There were nights when I worked late, rain streaking the windows, city lights blurred into something abstract and distant. I'd pause, coffee cooling beside me, and listen to the storm like it was keeping me company. In those moments, I felt a strange gratitude, for the silence, for the losses, for the version of me that had survived long enough to evolve. One evening, I found the old box again. The one with remnants of my former life. Letters. Photos. Receipts from places that no longer existed. I opened it carefully, expecting something to pull at me. Nothing did. I removed the letter, the one I'd carried through every phase of becoming, and read it one final time. The words were still kind. Still sincere. Still belonged to a different man. I folded it neatly. Then I placed it back in the box and closed the lid. Not because it hurt. Because it no longer belonged in the room where my future was being built. Weeks passed. Then months. People started noticing, not through announcements, but through results that couldn't be ignored. Names spoken differently. Invitations extended carefully. Respect offered without explanation. I accepted some. Declined others. I was selective now. Not because I was bitter, but because time had become my most valuable currency, and I no longer spent it on anything that didn't compound. One morning, as sunlight poured across my desk, illuminating charts and projections that once would have terrified me, I leaned back and felt something unfamiliar. Peace. Not the fragile kind. The earned kind. The kind that doesn't need applause to exist. I closed my laptop and stood by the window, watching the city wake up. Somewhere below, people hurried toward lives still chasing validation, still mistaking noise for progress. I didn't envy them. I had already lived that life. Success hadn't announced itself. But it had arrived. Quietly. Irreversibly. And as I turned back to my work, steady, deliberate, forward-facing, I understood something that would have broken the old version of me. The best revenge is invisibility paired with inevitability. And I was no longer becoming someone impressive. I was becoming someone permanent. The call came early morning. Not the kind of morning that feels important. The sky was still undecided, pale blue diluted with gray, the city half asleep and honest. My phone buzzed on the desk beside me, cutting through the silence I had learned to live inside. I almost ignored it. Unknown number. No urgency. No reason to expect anything extraordinary. Hello? I said, my voice still rough from sleep. There was a pause. Then a calm, professional introduction. A name. A title. Forbes, she said. The word didn't register immediately. It floated in the air between us, weightless, unreal. I leaned back in my chair, eyes drifting toward the window as if the answer might be written somewhere outside. We've been tracking your work, she continued. Your growth. Your numbers. Would like to feature you. Numbers. She said them next, figures I once would have repeated obsessively, whispered to myself like prayers. Now, they arrived fully formed, undeniable, spoken with certainty instead of doubt. I thanked her. Asked practical questions. Took notes. My hands didn't shake. When the call ended, the room felt unchanged. The desk. The chair. The painting on the wall, the lone figure walking into fog, steady and unafraid. I'd kept it there for a reason. I sat still for a long time. Not overwhelmed. Not triumphant. Just, quiet. This was supposed to be the moment, I thought. The moment people dream about. The moment I once imagined would erase everything that came before it. It didn't. Instead, it clarified it. The interview happened days later in a glass-walled office overlooking a city that finally looked small to me. The interviewer asked about my journey, where I started, what I lost, what it took to build something from nothing. I answered honestly, but carefully. I spoke about failure without dramatizing it. About discipline without glorifying pain. About timing, preparation, and luck, without bitterness, without blame. I noticed her listening closely, pen pausing more than once. She asked if there had been a moment that defined my success. I thought about it. The divorce papers. The empty apartment. The first night I chose planning over despair. There wasn't one moment, I said. There was a decision, to stop asking the world to believe in me and start building something that didn't need belief. She nodded. Afterward, I stepped into the restroom and stood in front of the mirror. The man looking back at me felt unfamiliar. Not because he looked successful, there were no obvious markers of that. He wore a simple suit. His hair slightly uncooperative. Lines under his eyes earned through years of focus, not exhaustion. What unsettled me was his expression. He wasn't angry. He wasn't bitter. There was no fire burning recklessly behind his eyes, no hunger screaming to be satisfied. Just steadiness. Control. A kind of calm that doesn't come from winning, but from finishing a long internal argument. I barely recognized him. I washed my hands slowly, the sound of running water grounding me. For a brief moment, a memory surfaced, standing in a similar bathroom years ago, loosening a cheap tie before going home to explain another failure. The way my reflection used to look away first. This man didn't. I returned home that evening as rain began to fall, light at first, then steady. The city blurred into motion outside my windows, headlights streaking like unfinished thoughts. I placed the magazine draft on my desk, unopened. I didn't rush to read it. Instead, I poured myself a drink and sat beside the window, watching the rain collect, slide, disappear. Weather had always felt symbolic to me, storms marking loss, quiet mornings marking resolve. This rain felt different. Cleansing. Closing. I thought about her then, not sharply, not painfully. Just briefly. I wondered if she'd see it. The article. The numbers. The face she once dismissed as uncertain. The thought didn't excite me. It didn't satisfy me. It passed. I realized something in that moment that surprised me more than the call itself. I was finished proving anything. Not to her. Not to them. Not even to myself. The need had dissolved somewhere along the way, quietly, without announcement. I no longer measured my worth by who stayed or who left, who doubted or who watched from a distance. I measured it by continuity. By whether I showed up the same way when no one was looking. Later that night, I finally opened the draft. My name in print. My story condensed into paragraphs that made struggle sound elegant, intentional. I smiled at the simplification. Truth is never that clean. I signed off on the final version without edits. Let them tell it their way, I thought. I know mine. Before bed, I opened the drawer where the old box still lived. The one I hadn't touched in months. Inside, memories waited patiently, no longer demanding anything from me. I removed one photograph, us, years ago, smiling into a future we couldn't agree on. I studied it for a moment, noticing details I'd missed before. How tense my shoulders were. How carefully she was smiling. I placed the photo back. Then I closed the drawer and locked it. Not to forget. To finish. As I lay in bed, the rain softened, fading into a distant rhythm. The city exhaled. So did I. Tomorrow would come with new demands, new expectations, new eyes watching carefully. I welcomed none of them. Because the man I had become didn't perform anymore. He built. He decided. He moved forward. And somewhere in the quiet space between recognition and indifference, I understood the final shift had already happened. Success hadn't changed me. Letting go had. I turned off the light, the darkness familiar and calm, and allowed myself one final thought before sleep claimed it. The world was just catching up. I had already arrived. I saw her in a hotel lobby. I wasn't looking for her. I wasn't expecting her. I had learned not to summon ghosts I'd already buried. The lobby was all glass and marble, too bright, too polished, designed to make everything look successful, even the people passing through. Soft music played somewhere overhead, the kind meant to disappear into the background. I was there for a meeting. Another ordinary step in an extraordinary life I no longer announced. I noticed her the way you notice a familiar song playing unexpectedly in a public place. Not suddenly. Not violently. Just, undeniably. She stood near the reception desk, posture perfect, coat draped over her arm like she still believed elegance could shield her from uncertainty. Her hair was styled carefully. Her heels clicked against the marble floor with the same confidence I remembered. Still elegant. Still proud. For a moment, time did something strange. It folded in on itself, pulling old memories forward without asking permission. Dinners we never finished. Conversations that ended in silence. A life that felt smaller every time I looked back on it. She hadn't seen me yet. I could have walked away. I didn't. Because I wasn't avoiding her anymore. And I wasn't chasing her either. I was simply, there. She turned slightly, distracted, adjusting the strap of her bag. That's when her eyes fell on the magazine resting on the low table between us. Forbes. The cover caught the light perfectly, glossy and deliberate. I had seen that cover dozens of times already, on desks, in hands, reflected in windows. It still didn't feel like mine. But this time, it wasn't about me seeing it. It was about her. Her gaze stopped. Completely. I watched her eyes move slowly, carefully, as if afraid the image might disappear if she blinked too hard. My face. My name. My worth. Printed in ink heavy enough to outlast doubt. Her lips parted slightly. Her hand tightened around her bag. I saw her breath catch, not dramatically, not loudly, but just enough to betray the shock she hadn't prepared for. Recognition bloomed across her face like something painful and undeniable. I saw the moment the past and present collided inside her. The man she left. The man she dismissed. The man she said she couldn't gamble her life on. Standing there, undeniable. Her knees buckled. It happened quickly, quietly. One step backward. A hand reaching for balance that wasn't there. The sound of her body meeting the floor was dull, almost soft, absorbed by carpet and shock. People rushed forward. Voices overlapped. Someone called for help. I didn't move. Not because I was cruel. But because I was finished rehearsing reactions. I stood there, hands in my pockets, watching strangers gather around her like concern could rewrite time. A hotel staff member knelt beside her, speaking urgently. Someone waved for water. She looked small on the floor. Not fragile. Just human. And in that moment, I searched myself for something I expected to find. Joy. Vindication. The sharp satisfaction of being seen too late. I felt none of it. No rush of triumph. No bitter smile forming. No internal monologue screaming now you understand. Just peace. A deep, unsettling calm that settled into my chest like a long exhale I hadn't realized I was holding. I realized then that this moment, the one so many people fantasize about, had already passed for me. I had imagined this once. Not consciously, but somewhere deep inside, during the loneliest nights. Her realizing. Her regretting. Her seeing me become everything she said I wasn't. But imagination feeds on unfinished wounds. Mine were already closed. She stirred slightly, eyes fluttering open. Confusion clouded her expression. As people helped her sit up, her gaze lifted, unsteady, searching. And then it found me. Our eyes met. There it was. Recognition led with disbelief. Regret fighting pride. 1,000 unspoken words crowding behind her eyes, desperate to escape. She said my name. Softly. Uncertainly. Like she was testing whether it still belonged to me. I nodded once. Not in greeting. Not in forgiveness. In acknowledgement. That was all. Paramedics arrived. They asked questions. Offered help. She waved them off weakly, insisting she was fine. Her eyes never left me, as if I might vanish if she looked away. I felt no obligation to stay. No responsibility to explain. The magazine still lay on the table between us, its cover slightly bent now from the commotion. I picked it up absent-mindedly, smoothing the edge with my thumb. The gesture felt symbolic in a way I didn't fully process yet. She watched me do it. Watched the ease. The familiarity. The lack of ceremony. I saw her mouth open, then close again. She swallowed, gathering courage. She began. I raised a hand gently. Not to stop her. To spare her. Some conversations arrived too late to matter. Some apologies belong to versions of us that no longer exist. I wasn't angry enough to reject her words. I was simply beyond them. I hope you're okay, I said. My voice surprised me. It was calm. Neutral. Honest. No edge. No warmth. Just truth. She nodded quickly, eyes shining with something that might have been tears, or realization. I didn't wait to see which. I turned and walked toward the exit, my footsteps steady against the marble floor. Behind me, the lobby resumed its rhythm. Conversation softened. The moment dissolved back into anonymity. Outside, the air was cool, touched with the promise of rain. Clouds hung low, heavy but restrained. I paused on the steps, breathing it in. For a second, I thought about the man I used to be, the one who would have needed this moment to mean something. To validate pain. To justify survival. I felt compassion for him. Then I let him go. As I stepped into the waiting car, my phone buzzed with a message from my assistant. Details for the next meeting, the next decision, the next forward step. Life continued. I glanced back once at the hotel doors before they slid shut, reflecting the city back at itself. Inside, she was still sitting there, surrounded by help she hadn't expected to need. Outside, I moved on. And as the car pulled away, rain finally began to fall, soft at first, then steady, washing the street clean of footprints, reflections blurring into something indistinct. I leaned back, watching the city pass by, feeling lighter than I had in years. Not because she saw me, but because when she did, I realized I no longer needed to be seen at all. The past had finally caught up. And for the first time, it couldn't touch me. She tried to talk. Not immediately. Not impulsively. It happened days after the lobby, after the fainting, after the silence, after the moment the past finally collided with a present she hadn't prepared for. My phone buzzed late one evening while rain traced familiar paths down my windows, the city glowing softly like it was pretending nothing had changed. Her name appeared on the screen. I stared at it longer than I should have. Not because my heart raced. Not because hope stirred. But because it felt like reading a chapter title from a book I had already finished. I answered. "Can we talk?" she asked. Her voice sounded smaller than I remembered. Careful. Like she was afraid even sound might push me away. "We already are," I said. There was a pause. Then a breath, steadying herself. She asked to meet. I agreed. Not out of obligation. Not out of curiosity. But because closure, when it's real, doesn't fear conversation. We met in a quiet cafe near the river, the kind of place built for confessions. Low lighting, soft music, table space just far enough apart to protect secrets. Rain tapped against the windows again, consistent and patient, like it had followed me through every turning point of this story. She was already there when I arrived. She stood when she saw me, then hesitated, unsure whether to hug me or stay still. The indecision answered a question I hadn't asked. We chose distance. She looked different, not worse, not better. Just rearranged. As if life had shifted her priorities without asking for permission. Her hands trembled slightly as she wrapped them around her cup. I didn't know, she began. I sat across from her, resting my hands on the table, posture relaxed. I listened. I didn't know you were building something like that, she continued. If I had known. She stopped herself, swallowing the rest of the sentence like it might betray her. If I had known. The phrase echoed softly in my head. She talked for a long time. She apologized. She explained. She tried to rewrite history. She spoke about fear. About pressure. About how heavy uncertainty felt when everyone around her seemed to be moving forward. She said she never meant to hurt me. That she thought leaving was the honest thing to do. She said she believed in me once. I just didn't know how long belief was supposed to last, she whispered. I watched her as she spoke, not critically, not cruelly. Just attentively. I noticed how often she searched my face for reaction, for reassurance, for something to tell her whether she was getting closer to forgiveness or farther from it. I gave her neither. I listened quietly. Not because I was numb. But because I was complete. When she finally stopped talking, the silence stretched between us, heavy but not uncomfortable. Outside, the rain slowed, droplets sliding down the glass like punctuation marks ending a long sentence. She waited. For absolution. For anger. For emotion. Something. I took a breath. I believe you, I said. Her shoulders relaxed instantly, relief flooding her expression. But belief isn't the same as alignment, I continued. Her brow furrowed slightly. You didn't leave because you were cruel, I said. You left because you wanted certainty. And I don't fault you for that. She nodded, tears gathering, encouraged by my calm. But you're not apologizing because you understand what you did, I added softly. You're apologizing because now you can see the outcome. The words landed gently, but firmly. Her lips parted, then closed again. I wasn't finished. When I needed belief, I said, you needed proof. When I was becoming, you needed arrival. That gap isn't something an apology can close. She looked down at her hands. I was scared, she said. I know, I replied. And I did. Fear had shaped both of us, just in different directions. She reached into her bag then, hesitating before pulling something out. A folded piece of paper. Old. Worn. I kept this, she said, sliding it across the table. I recognized it immediately. One of my old letters. Words I had written late at night when the future still felt shared. Dreams written carefully, optimistically, as if writing them down would protect them. I didn't touch it. I read it after the article, she said. I realized I left before the hardest part was over. I met her eyes again. The hardest part wasn't the struggle, I said. It was being alone in it. Her breath hitched. She waited for me to say more. I didn't. Some truths don't need elaboration. I miss you, she said finally. The words were quiet. Vulnerable. Honest. And for the first time since the cafe door had closed behind me, I felt something shift. Not longing. But gratitude. Because once, those words would have undone me. Now, they simply confirmed how far I'd come. I don't, I said. Not harshly. Not defensively. Truthfully. The finality of it settled between us like dust in still air. I stood, placing enough money on the table to cover both drinks. The letter remained where it was, untouched, its purpose fulfilled simply by being seen. She stood too, panic flickering across her face. So that's it, she asked. After everything? I looked at her for a long moment, at the woman I had loved deeply, imperfectly, honestly. At the version of myself she had outgrown before I ever had the chance to grow. Yes, I said. That's it. She searched my face one last time, desperate for something, anything, to hold on to. But closure doesn't need dialogue when growth has already spoken. I walked past her, past the window, past the reflection of who I used to be. The door opened, a bell chiming softly as if marking an ending rather than an exit. Outside, the rain had stopped. The street smelled clean. New. Unburdened. I walked without looking back. Behind me, she sat alone with a letter that no longer belonged to either of us. Ahead of me, the city waited, alive, unfinished, unconcerned with what I had left behind. As I stepped forward, I felt no regret. Only space. And in that space, something even quieter than peace took root. Freedom. Not from her. From the version of myself that once needed her to understand. I didn't win because she lost. That truth settled into me slowly, like light finding its way into a room that had been closed for years. There was no scoreboard, no final whistle, no crowd to confirm the outcome. Just me, standing in the quiet of a morning that belonged entirely to myself. I won because I survived. Survival doesn't look heroic from the outside. It looks like getting up when no one is watching. Like choosing discipline when motivation has died. Like learning how to sit with yourself when the only company left is doubt and memory. I didn't conquer the world, I simply refused to disappear inside it. The apartment I lived in then was small but intentional. White walls. One desk by the window. No excess. No reminders. I had learned the difference between minimalism and emptiness the hard way. One is chosen. The other is abandoned. Sunlight spilled across the floor in sharp lines, cutting through dust that floated like unspoken thoughts. I stood there barefoot, coffee cooling in my hand, and realized something quietly revolutionary. The past no longer fit. Not like a wound that still aches when pressed, but like a coat 2 sizes too small. Familiar, once comforting, now restrictive. I could remember her without folding inward. I could say her name in my head without it echoing. That's when I understood. Sometimes, the greatest justice isn't retribution. It's completion. People like to romanticize revenge. They imagine it loud. Public. Perfectly timed. But revenge requires you to keep the past alive, to carry it with you like a loaded weapon. Growth demands the opposite. Growth asks you to set the weapon down and build something with both hands instead. I didn't get rich to prove her wrong. I got focused because pain demanded a direction. There were nights early on when exhaustion made my hands shake, when the glow of my laptop felt like the only proof I still existed. Rejection emails stacked up like quiet insults. Deals fell through. Promises evaporated. I learned to stop expecting fairness from timing. Instead, I learned patience. I learned how to fail without dramatizing it. How to extract lessons the way a sculptor chips away stone, slowly, deliberately, without apology. Every mistake sharpened me. Every loss clarified what mattered. Pain became a language I was fluent in. While others sought comfort, I sought structure. While some escaped into distractions, I built routines so tight they left no room for self-pity. Mornings began before the sun. Evenings ended with notebooks filled with plans that scared me a little more each time. Fear, I learned, was a compass. The first time money stopped being a problem, I didn't celebrate. I stared at the number on the screen and waited for something to break inside me. Nothing did. Relief came, yes, but quietly. Like a locked door finally opening without ceremony. I wasn't poor. I was early. Early is misunderstood. Early looks like failure to people who can't see trajectories. Early feels like isolation when everyone else seems settled. But early is where foundations are poured, out of sight, unglamorous, essential. She couldn't love early. And that didn't make her evil. It made her human. There was a moment, weeks after the cafe, months after the lobby, when I found one last artifact from that life. An old photograph slipped from a book I hadn't opened in years. We were laughing in it, midsummer, the world still soft around the edges. I studied it carefully. Not with longing. Not with bitterness. With respect. That version of me had loved sincerely. Had believed openly. Had given without keeping score. I didn't resent him anymore. I thanked him. He carried me as far as he could. The rest was up to me. I folded the photograph once. Then again. And placed it in a drawer. Not as a secret. As a chapter. Success, when it fully arrives, doesn't make noise. It rearranges your silence. The rooms get larger. The air feels different. Conversations change, not because you demand it, but because your presence does. People started asking for advice I once begged for. Doors opened without me knocking. My calendar filled with things that mattered instead of people who needed convincing. And still, I stayed quiet. No announcements. No victory laps. Legacy isn't loud while it's being built. One evening, I stood before a blank canvas in my office. A gift from a client, unused for months. I dipped a brush into dark paint and let instinct guide my hand. Lines formed. Then shapes. Then contrast. Chaos slowly finding order. By the time I stepped back, something unexpected stared back at me. Not a portrait. A horizon. It struck me then, how fitting it was. I had stopped painting portraits of the past and started imagining distances instead. Futures weren't faces. They were directions. And mine stretched far. I sometimes wonder who I would have become if she had stayed. The question doesn't haunt me anymore. It answers itself. Smaller. Safer. Paused in potential, waiting for permission to begin. Love, real love, should expand you. But the wrong timing, even with the right person, can turn affection into an anchor. She needed certainty. I needed becoming. Those needs were never enemies. They were simply incompatible. Now, standing in the life I once only described in half-formed sentences, I understand the quiet irony of it all. If she had stayed, I might have settled. If I had settled, this future wouldn't exist. I belong here, not because I earned it through suffering, but because I refused to let suffering be the end of my story. I belong to a version of myself that doesn't ask for validation, that doesn't rehearse old conversations in the shower, that doesn't flinch at memories. I belong to tomorrow. And tomorrow doesn't recognize the man I was when she left. Sometimes, late at night, when the city hums low and the lights blur into something almost gentle, I feel a flicker of gratitude, for her honesty, for the ending, for the silence that followed. Not because it hurt, but because it forced me to listen. To myself. I didn't win because she lost. I won because I became whole enough that winning stopped being the point. And as I turn off the lights and step into the quiet, one final truth settles in my chest, steady, unshakable, complete. Some people are chapters. Others are catalysts. And a few are endings that make beginnings inevitable.